You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Dailey and Kevin Laramée.
Hello and welcome to episode number 18 of Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. My name is Mark Dailey, and I'm joined tonight here in the virtual SPN motorhome by my friend and co-host, Mr. Kevin Laramée. Kevin, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Mark. Sorry I couldn't be there the last show. It was too many things going on at once, and I couldn't keep up with the F1 schedule. I have now been, doing my homework, and I am all up to date. And I have to say, since the last time we talked, a lot of things changed. Lewis Hamilton is not first anymore in the championship. It is Nico Rosberg with 23 points. We just saw a Red Bull double, and guess what? Ferrari is not the second best team in Formula One, and now it's for real. A lot of things changed in the last few months.
Yeah, definitely. But it was kind of interesting when I decided to sit down and do that the last show by myself there, that when it was all said and done, it came out to exactly 25 minutes. And then when I went and looked back in the catalog of Scuderia F1, that most of the shows come out between 45 and 50 minutes. So I ended up talking for the same amount of time as usual. It's just that you weren't there, so
I wasn't there to do
ended
the
up
other
with
half.
exactly 50% of the show.
Exactly. Well, it's still pretty good. So, no, a very interesting start. Let's just start with the start, right? Let's start at the beginning with this race. We had, nothing. We don't really talk about the qualifying, and people were wondering, why do you talk about the qualifying? Because it's always Mercedes first and second, or close to it, if nothing happens. So, it's not really a talking point, the qualifying, Mark.
Well, that's right. There was so much going on, and the qualifying was quite interesting, as you were saying. It was Lewis Hamilton that qualified in first, quite a ways ahead of his teammate Nico Rosberg in second. Again, we saw the Red Bulls on row number 2 and the Ferraris on row number 3. And it kind of changed around by the time they got to turn 1, once they actually got into the race itself, that Nico Rosberg and Sebastian Vettel had a bit of a coming together. We were talking about it just before we started recording here, and we've looked at it from a number of different angles, and
I've looked at it from
obviously it was Vettel's fault.
Yeah, well, even the commentator was like, I don't think it's nobody else's fault. But when you look at the replay from Vettel's car, from Verstappen's car, from Nico Rosberg's car, and the overall replay, you see a pattern here where Rosberg was putting himself a little outside of the first turn, so he's middle inside of the second, so he has a good exit for the third. That's the theory. Verstappen is a little bit there outside of the Mercedes in the back and close to it, but not in a threatening fashion, and he's at the right place. When you look at Vettel, he goes inside all of everybody and tries to turn at the last time, and he's the one who rams into Rosberg. Almost ruins Rosberg's race, but at the end he didn't. Rosberg finished third. Ruins his own race because Vettel's out of the race, and could have ruined Verstappen's race if he didn't have the wherewithal to keep the car on the track. So, no, Vettel's mistake, now it's been, a few Grand Prix now in a row that he's making really bad mistakes, and it's getting quite unfortunate, and Kimi Räikkönen is in front of his teammates in the Drivers' Championship, and it's been the 7th time this season that those two have swapped places, and Räikkönen is definitely looking like the best Ferrari driver as we speak, having a new contract for next year too.
Well, isn't that funny? Because earlier in this year, there was a lot of talk that maybe Ferrari is not getting the most value for money, or they'd be better to put somebody else other than Kimi Räikkönen into that second Ferrari. But he's proved everyone wrong. I mean, obviously, I don't think there's any doubting the talent that Kimi Räikkönen has as a driver. So I thought that was a bit unusual to say. But wow,
was the hunger. I was questioning the hunger. And I guess he has
hunger.
It,
yeah,
right?
that was exactly it, right?
But I guess his fights with Verstappen probably rekindled that hunger too, to hang out with the young guns, right? So he has that going on, right? And even in this race, we saw it happen a few times where Verstappen and Räikkönen were close to each other, and we've seen this. The battle with Ricciardo and Verstappen, it actually brought a new, fresh heir to F1 Verstappen this year. But Raikkonen, he rekindled his love to the way he loves to drive over the last few races.
And definitely, it's really amazing to see where Sebastian Vettel is, or maybe more accurately, where he isn't at the moment. And you just don't expect to see Sebastian Vettel doing things like that. I mean, to his credit, he owned it after the Grand Prix and apologized to Nico Rosberg, because when you're watching in the heat of the moment, you just see a big cloud of smoke just from the way that the camera angles switch so quickly. And it took me a couple of seconds to realize that the Ferrari had disappeared and Rosberg had disappeared, and it was Lewis Hamilton and the Red Bulls and Kimi Räikkönen and then the rest of the field disappearing into turn number 2. And I thought, wow, that's just ruined Nico Rosberg's day. I mean, fortunately, he didn't sustain any damage, whereas Vettel, obviously, his left front tire was and suspension was obviously heavily damaged, and that was it. But the last time we saw a bit of a crazy harebrained move like that, a driver was busted all the way back down to Scuderia Toro Rosso. So I don't think that they have that option in Ferrari. But it just goes to prove just what a disappointing year it has been for Ferrari. What an underwhelming year, and thank God that, just sort of to bring this all full circle, that they do have Kimi Räikkönen, because if it wasn't for him putting in some of the performances and getting some of the results that he's had, especially over the last several races, it would be a pretty bleak and dark season. So thank God for Kimi if you're a Ferrari fan. And
their workhorse type of result too, no pun intended with Ferrari here with horses. But you know what I mean is their consistency type of result. He's there, he doesn't do the big mistake or the big crash or the big not saving his tires, not saving fuel. He's managing everything, and that's why Raikkonen is an efficient driver. He's cold, calm, collected, calculated. That's the type of driver that Raikkonen is, and it is, over the long run, over a season, the most probable good way to look at a season, to get percentage-wise, like the probability-wise, to get the best season possible, is if you do even keel all the season long, right? Trying to get third or fourth all season long, and you eventually have a good season. That's the type of approach that they're trying to do, because, well, they can't touch Mercedes, and now they can't touch Red Bull. But he's trying to get the most out of his car by staying on the track, not trying to move, and being the smartest guy out there.
Yeah, and honestly, he's not really all that far off Daniel Ricciardo in the drivers' championship. Ricciardo's got 204 points, and Raikkonen is on 160. So, I mean, obviously, it would take a lot for him to overhaul Ricciardo at this point in the year, but he's not all that far behind him. And as you said, he's surpassed Kimi Räikkönen. Sorry, Kimi Räikkönen hasn't overtaken himself in the drivers' championship, but as you said, he has passed Sebastian Vettel, who's got 153 points. But also, what's really interesting, just talking a little bit more about Sebastian Vettel and the drivers' championship, is that Max Verstappen is sneaking up on him in a hurry. As I mentioned, Seb has 153 points, and Verstappen is on 147. So he's really going to have to pull his socks up and buckle down in the last 5 races of the year, because he could end up even lower down in the standings. I think that obviously Valtteri Bottas is not going to catch him in 7th, and just because he's only got 80 points, but he could literally find himself in the bottom of that top,
the worst of the top
drivers.
6. He could be the worst of the top 3 teams, absolutely. But Verstappen, just you mentioned, interesting tidbit of information. The points that he did gather with Toro Rosso are including in the points that he has with Red Bull. It's the drivers' championship, not a constructors' championship in this. So the points that he did gather with both teams are included. Same for Danny Kvyat, but there's a lot less points.
Yeah,
Danny Kvyat with those 2 names next to him as well.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's all sort of worked out this year. But Verstappen, again, had a pretty good race. And I really think that the move that Red Bull did to bump him up from Toro Rosso into the Red Bull senior team has really invigorated the whole F1. Really invigorated Formula One. I mean, I think it's really put pressure under Ricciardo, because he obviously lost the Spanish Grand Prix to his teammate. Then he lost Monaco, and he was sort of, I think, in a little bit lost there for a little while. And I think he's really being pushed by Verstappen to stay in front of him. And you mentioned some of the duels that Raikkonen and Verstappen have had over the last couple of months. So it's really proved to be good. And of course, there was that memorable exchange that Rosberg and Verstappen had in right by the wall of champions. Mixed it up with a lot of drivers. It's been really fun to watch.
No, exactly. So it's fascinating. Speaking of fascinating here, we didn't talk a lot about Mercedes because, well, for once, none of Mercedes won, Mark. Nico Rosberg third. Lewis Hamilton wasn't in position to win until his engine blew. And you know what Lewis Hamilton talked about, Mark, at the end? There's a little feeling here of conspiracy. He mentioned that it's weird that out of all the Mercedes engines in the entire field in F1, only his has a lot of problem in 2016. Funny how that goes.
Well, I seem to remember last year watching a Mercedes flamethrower at Monza, and that time it was Nico Rosberg. So they're not immune to these things, but it has been quite unusual to see all the problems that Lewis has had throughout the years, or not throughout the years, but just this year in general. But I thought it was quite interesting the way that he put it after the race, saying he said something to the effect of that somebody
doesn't want him to win. Someone doesn't want him to win, which then means it might be just one installer guy who doesn't know how to straighten his boat properly. I don't know. Maybe that's the reason. But I like Martin Blundell said, there cannot be a lot of pure bad luck is one. Someone who sabotages the engine is two. Third one is installation problem. And fourth one is driver habit that is tough on the engine. Outside of those four, there's not a lot of things that can go wrong with the engine. Those are probably one of those fours.
Well, it's very interesting too because Helmut Marko from Red Bull, he reckons that it was the pressure that Verstappen Ricciardo put on Hamilton that really forced him to race as hard and as fast as he could in Malaysia, and he thinks that that led to Hamilton's engine blowing up 16 laps from the end. And he even said that they had another trick up their sleeve. He didn't reveal what it was because they didn't ultimately need to resort to anything like that. But I think it was kind of interesting. But I don't know. I think Lewis did clarify afterwards that he was referring to some sort of higher power, I think is the quote that he used or the words that he used.
Yeah, that's what you say to cover yourself.
Mercedes. I mean, Toto Wolff and Niki Lauda said, well, you can understand why he's frustrated. We're not going to fine him, and we're not going to say that he can say certain things. And I guess that's kind of interesting and refreshing to a certain extent. But you can understand why Hamilton would say that because it does seem that he's getting an unfair share of the mechanical problems, specifically with all components of the power unit.
No, he is. But look, when he says at the end, I meant a higher power, it's to backtrack. It's to cover his tracks. It's to cover what he said in the heat of the moment. But in the heat of the moment, when he mentioned on the radio and on to Rachel Hunter after the race from Sky Sports, he mentioned someone doesn't want me to win. It's weird that always that happens, and it's always to Nico's favor when that happens, right? And he puts two and two together in the heat of the moment. He's not happy. So there must be something else going on behind the scenes that he feels Nico gets a better treatment than him. So in the heat of the moment, when he gets that emotional reaction, this is triggered not just by this, but by probably other experiences that he had when the week or weeks before this Grand Prix. So I don't know if Nico gets the better seat in the bus or, that type of thing that he might not think is a fair shake. So that might be the case in Mercedes right now.
Yeah, and I think now we're at that point in the discussion that we should talk a little bit more about Nico Rosberg because obviously he had the coming together with Sebastian Vettel right in turn one there at the start. But who would have thought that an hour and a half later he would be standing on the bottom step of the podium? So
he was last. Whereas
things really worked out a couple of races ago for Lewis Hamilton in Belgium, where he had took what was that 55 grid penalty to replace all the bits and pieces on his power unit, and then he ended up on third because of the safety car and all the things that worked out. This time it worked out in Nico Rosberg's favor, and what was a very small margin at the beginning of the race of 8 points has now grown up to 23. So not quite a full race victory, but definitely with 5 races left to go in the year, that's putting a nice bit of comfort between himself and Lewis Hamilton for Nico Rosberg. But that really worked out, and definitely you can see why that engine failure really would have upset Hamilton, because what with all the problems that he only has 2 power units left for the rest of the year. He's got one new one, and he's got another engine that has already got 3 races on it. So he's already talking about that he might skip some of the practice sessions between now and the end of the year, and Toto Wolff doesn't want that to do that, because of course he's not going to get the full benefit of getting all the laps in that he needs
and
before
then Red Bull's going to
qualifying.
come, and Red Bull's going to get closer if they don't get all the practice time needed. So it's a vicious cycle. Absolutely.
Definitely.
But for Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, it's funny how this race has unfolded this season. People talk about, it's not going to be interesting, it's just Mercedes. But the battle between the two, how it's shifted from 45 points up on one side, down to 9 on the other side, to 8 to 23. The way it looks now, it's going to be very tough for Hamilton to claw back all the points, because even if Hamilton wins every single race left, there's 5 races left. If he wins all those 5 races, but Rosberg finishes second in all the races, well, it's almost a dead tie at the end of the season. So it could be fascinating that way, and that if everything goes right for Hamilton, which this hasn't been the case. And for Rosberg, he was last at one point in this race, Mark. After the collision and all the ramification from it, he was last and had a 10-second penalty too. So don't forget about this in that race, and still finish third behind, well, let's face it, a great race by Ricciardo and by Verstappen, who fought for position and were able to benefit from the retiring of Hamilton, but still put themselves in a position to benefit from it before that.
Well, definitely. And you say that, of course, we were expecting Mercedes to dominate in 2016, and they have to a certain extent. And I think that one of the saving graces that has maybe prevented all and out Mercedes domination this year is the pleasant surprise that has been Red Bull Racing. And it wasn't even necessarily limited to just when Max Verstappen got promoted to the big team. Even the unfortunate Danny Kvyat had a couple of good outings. Well, obviously before the Russian Grand Prix, that really sealed his fate. But that car and that Renault engine have really, I think they've really performed more than most people have expected around Formula One. So that has been pleasant to see, and
it bodes well for next year, Mark, with the Red Bull engine and all the new changes next year, which technically it's supposed to level the playing field across the board. So this, combined with the gap closing and the performance by Red Bull this weekend, and even Ferrari were closer to Red Bull, that were closer to Mercedes at one point. So no, it bodes well for the next year with development that's going to be taking place until next year.
Yeah, and that's right. And I think it's interesting to point out that prior to 2014, Mercedes had spent years developing and preparing their car for the new rule changes that came in a couple of years ago. But with the rules that are coming out for next year, they all have had about the same sort of time frame to work with. So
yeah,
they don't have anybody like Mercedes.
Sorry, Mike, I was just going to say, it was decided just a few months ago what the rules are going to be. The width, and we talked about it on the show, the width and length of the car, the type of engine, the type of, not the halo this year, those could be coming probably in 2 years from now, but just the design of the car. This has been made public and agreed upon just a few months ago, basically like about 8 weeks ago.
That's right, and then that just sort of levels the playing field, like you say, that not only are the new specifications and the new rules meant to even out the performance on the track between the different teams, but also just even the development stage, all the teams will have had a similar time or identical time to design the cars for 2017, and I believe that Force India had actually stopped quite a while ago developing this year's car, which is still obviously going pretty good, but they've gone to develop the 2017 car, which I'm really looking forward to seeing what they're going to look like. We've heard different things about about the testing for the tires and things like that. And yes, I think Sebastian Vettel said that recently he's still not 100% happy with the Pirelli tires for next year. But we'll talk about that later. But
well,
just
the way I get the feeling of Vettel this year, I think he'll never be really quite truly happy with anything. He's always
I
finding.
think that he's probably wants to fast forward to November 21st or whatever the last race of the year is, because considering the season that he's had, that's unless he can find something to be positive about over the next month and a half.
You know what I'll do before the end of the season? I'll do an audio montage of all the Vettel quotes of 2016 in races. Oh, what a crazy idiot! What he's doing! Oh my God, what are you thinking? F word, beep, beep, beep. I'm going to make a big montage of all that. I think it's going to last about an hour because there were so many this year.
So many of them. Well, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to throw in Max Verstappen's radio from this weekend when Sebastian Vettel came and snuck up the inside and took out Nico Rosberg. But just talking about Rosberg again there, and you'd already mentioned the 10-second penalty that he picked up, and that looked to really maybe ruin his afternoon, which had been really turned around in a very dramatic way. I think that they really got his strategy right, and he put in some very good laps to get back up as high as he was, but he was stuck behind Kimi Räikkönen there in the closing stages of the race, and he pretty well, I think he called it a very aggressive move on Kimi Räikkönen in turn number 2. He did really pull in, and it was a very aggressive move, and there wasn't much room, because you can see Räikkönen as he's turning into turn 2, he starts to ease off, but Rosberg still collects the end plate on his wing, and Rosberg said that he was surprised that he was given the 10-second penalty for that from the stewards, but I don't think he should have been too surprised. I mean, yes, it was aggressive, and that was probably the nice way to put it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it was aggressive, but he had to go for the most amount of point necessary, knowing that Hamilton was out, knowing he had a chance of creating a gap, of creating a biggest gap as possible. He had to almost go for it. So it could be it's understandable why Rosberg would take such a risk. And at the end of the day, well, I guess he was right, because, that risk didn't pan out, but he was able to continue the momentum, creating his confidence by literally passing everybody that day except the Red Bulls, and, got into position to finish third at the end of the day.
Yeah, and considering how the qualifying had gone and how they'd really... I don't think it's unfair to suggest that they had dominated qualifying, and it just kind of seemed one of those circuits that it would just be a pair of Mercedes cars out front, and that was how it was going to be all afternoon. Obviously, it didn't turn out that way, so that was quite a pleasant surprise, but it was really good to see. And I think that if you're Nico Rosberg, you have to be feeling pretty good, pretty confident with that result, because now we go to Suzuka, which is basically going to start with the practice sessions just in a few hours after we finish this show. But I mean the races are going to come pretty quick here to wrap up the season, and it was a great result for him, no doubt about it.
A couple of tidbits of information. Interesting that Stoffel Van Dorn has 1 point for McLaren. That's earlier this season. I meant that because there's a new guy with only 1 point now, because we have Pascal Verheyen and Stoffel Van Dorn for the longest time with 1 point. Now, from Renault Sport F1, Jolyon Palmer, his first point of the season, finally in the top 10, in 10th position for him. It's about time, a Brit in the points. Button finished 9th. That's also Button in the points again, with a great start by Button, and he was even 4th at 1 point in the drag, but eventually all the cars went past him, and in the subsequent turn he got past, finished 9th at the end of the day. But for Jolyon Palmer, his first point in F1.
Yeah, and that was good to see as well, because he's really struggled at times this year. And again, it was good to see Jenson Button with the McLaren, a double points finish again, because Fernando Alonso finished 7th. He was another one who really benefited, but he did very well at the start there. He was really low down on the grid and ended up in the top 10 right after the first couple of corners. Force India had another strong showing with Hulkenberg in 8th and Sergio Perez in 6th. and Valtteri Bottas finished in 5th, which was a fairly good showing because Williams has really been nowhere the last half dozen races.
Yeah.
Maybe they've really sort of fallen off after starting the season fairly well. But I think the biggest disappointment of the entire weekend for I guess the best of the rest is basically anybody that isn't driving a Mercedes or to some extent a Red Bull. But what was the Haas team? Romain Grosjean crashed out early when he had a brake failure. And then Esteban Gutierrez had to withdraw from the race later on because the wheel nut came off on his tire. So the Haas tricycle didn't actually drive all that well. And the team was actually fined by the stewards for that. I think it was something like 5,000 euros and have to present a report on why it was a technical failure.
And what steps they're going to take to make sure that doesn't happen again. Because they have to do like an action plan on it because it's the type of thing that it's dangerous for the safety of the actual fans and supporters. We've seen this in the history of F1 or other race where at some points there was a chain involved holding the tire to the axle. If there was any break of the axle and the tire would go free, there was a chain retaining it close. Or because we've seen tires bounce and land in stands and kill people in NASCAR and IndyCar racing and in F1 in the past. So it is always a very serious infraction to have a wheel detached from your car, because the momentum it has, the force that it does generate with the spin and centrifugal force, that word force, it's very important, and it could be quite dangerous if it lands in a stand somewhere close where it's populated.
Yeah, definitely. It can be very, very dangerous, but it was very unusual just to see him driving along and all of a sudden the tire came off. I guess what they were saying was that the wheel nut didn't fasten properly. But it's been several tough races again for Haas. Grosjean didn't even start in Singapore a couple of weeks ago because he had a problem with the brakes again. So that was disappointing to see. And one thing we forgot to mention was Vettel was also handed 2 penalty points on his super license for that first corner coming together with Nico Rosberg. So he's got 4 penalty points on his super license that he's accumulated over the past 12 months. And then you get a suspension, I believe, is once you get to 12. So you've had to been quite naughty to accumulate that many points.
Well, yeah, but he's getting up there because that's a lot of incident this year with Vettel. As much as we like to say, it's because of Kvyat this season or others. Well, Vettel's, you have to be 2 to tango. And when you're always the tango partner, sometimes it's not just coincidence.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he was completely to blame for that one, and I think it was a fair result that he got those couple of penalty points put on them. So, so now it is Japan this week, and I guess this is, I wouldn't say it's last chance territory for Lewis Hamilton, but definitely there isn't the room or the luxury to have any of these unfortunate technical failures or any problems. He's really going to have to maximize the results and the points that he gets over the last 5 races. I would think that, I guess you could say that more the pressure might be on him rather than Rosberg at the moment.
Yeah, and before we wrap this show up, Mark, I want to mention a little congratulations to a name that will be more popular in Formula One, probably starting next year, probably with Williams as well. Lance Stroll has won the F3 Championship in Europe. Even though there's 1 weekend left with 3 races, he has won the championship, and he is from Mont-Tremblant, from Montreal region, from Quebec, Canada. He is looking to become the next Canadian driver in F1. His father is obviously a very wealthy man, so maybe that combined can make him a contender for Williams for next year to take the place of Felipe Massa.
Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be nice to see another Canadian driver?
He is, by the way, the rights of Williams, and we all know Williams and Canadian drivers, what it did in the past. Especially drivers from the region of Quebec or Montreal or Canada.
Yeah, well, exactly. There was a certain fellow by the name, what was it, Jacques Villeneuve?
What was it? I don't know. One of my idols of all time, Jacques Villeneuve.
I actually, right here at home in my office here, I have an autographed picture from Jacques Villeneuve. It was funny, a couple of years ago, we go up to a little town in the interior of British Columbia here called Osoyoos, and it's a nice resort town, very little town. Anyhow, there's a resort there, and one day we just happened to be visiting, and we were going back to the car, and happened to walk by. And there was this very, very big man. And I did a double take, and I realized it was Gino Ojic. So people who are hockey fans and perhaps fans of the Vancouver Canucks will be familiar with Gino Ojic. Anyway, so I started talking to Gino, and he mentioned that he was there, and some people were visiting, and I guess maybe he was one of the investors in this resort there, and he mentioned that Jacques Villeneuve was there as well. So sure enough, he said, well, go inside. Jacques inside, and I had my kids with me, so we went inside, and there he was. Formula One world champion Jacques Villeneuve, very nice guy. So that was cool to see.
I'll remember it like it's yesterday.
Yeah. Oh, that was, yeah. I mean, for Canadian sports fans and Canadian Formula One fans, how could you ever forget that?
1996, his first F1 season, finishes second behind Damon Hill, which is the only year Damon Hill won the Drivers' Championship. The year after, he finishes first. We all remember the Michael Schumacher move where he goes into Villeneuve. Oh, Schumacher's in the gravel pit. He's stuck. Villeneuve will win the championship. Oh, I remember it like it's yesterday.
Was it 1997? Was that when Jacques had like the frosted spiky hair?
Yes, at one point, yes, he did. That's when he won. That's what he had.
Yeah. Well, he does. He can't pull that look off anymore. But again, he's 20 years older now. But still, that would be very cool to see a Canadian driver back into Formula One, especially with a good team. Well, what are the better teams? Let's just say as Williams. So that would be very, very cool.
And in history of Formula One, when they introduce new rules and new car design, that first or second year, usually Williams is the type of team, because of their experience of the last 40 years, it's helpful for them to adapt quicker. So hopefully it'll be an advantage for them for next season, hopefully with a driver from Canada, Lance Stroll.
Definitely. Oh, and just talking a little bit about the news, apparently Mercedes has taken up an option to perhaps join Formula E, which will be making its debut in Montreal next year as well. So that will be interesting to see what they can do in Formula E. Toto Wolff was saying, obviously, with the electrification of cars, that Formula E will just become more and more relevant over time, and who knows what the face of motorsport will look like 20 years down the road now, where
we all know that
one
day there won't be any fossil fuel to use, so we need to find an alternative, and sooner rather than later.
Yeah, so that was pretty cool to see. So who knows? Maybe in 2 years you will be able to, when you go to cover the Formula E race in Montreal, perhaps there will be a Mercedes there. But they definitely have their work ahead of them if they're going to join that series. So what else do we have for this week, Kevin?
I think it wraps it up on my side, but just to finish on Formula E, it's becoming quite the interesting championship. At the beginning, it was independent teams, and now big constructors are getting behind it. Big batteries, big companies are getting behind it because they believe, and in a way they are right, what Formula One did for automobile industry in the late 90s, early 2000s. So what you see, the technology you see on your cars now, a lot of them were invented for Formula One. So it does bring to the knowledge of car making. It does help that knowledge. It does bring it to a higher level. And if you bring this to the Formula E world, it might be beneficial for companies like Audi, like BMW, like Mercedes, that are all getting involved into the Formula E championship. It's going to be beneficial for them for the future to learn how to do more efficient electric cars, so that they can produce for everyday use cars that are more efficient, for not just for the environment, but for everybody's wallet and for all those reasons. So that's what's interesting with that Formula E, is the forefront of what you can do competitively with an electric car, but it will lead to advanced technology that will be used in everyday type of electric car.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. I haven't really followed up on it, but the other week there was that report that came out that McLaren and Apple were perhaps talking to each other, that Apple might be considering making a move to buy out the McLaren group.
So how long before Siri is one of the drivers of the e-Formula? You have 19 human and Siri. You have 19 drivers and Siri.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't even get Siri to work correctly whenever I need to use it for something useful, let alone trying to win a motor race. So I don't know if that would be the best thing. So we'll see whether or not there's anything to that. But I guess the crux of that story was that Apple obviously is interested in developing a self-driving car. But the logic behind perhaps buying the McLaren group is that they have the technology arm of it, and Apple is perhaps more interested in developing the brains of the self-driving car and not necessarily developing or designing the car around it as much. So that would be kind of cool, and I wonder if that would be in a change of the hood badge on one of your McLarens. Would it be like now an iCar
oh my
or something?
God.
Or?
The Apple geeks will all go to the store. We'll all go to McLaren. They'll wait in line for 4 days to be sure they're the first one to buy the $200,000 iCar. They were the first one to have the iMcLaren. Oh my God.
Yeah, that just goes kind of down a dark road. But anyways, one final piece of housekeeping before we go for this week. We've launched a Formula One News pit stop, which will come out a couple of times a week, depending how much news there is, just because sometimes there is too much of a gap between Grand Prix, and these are just intended to be short little things, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 minutes. So if you're already subscribed to the show on SPN or wherever you're downloading the Scuderia F1 podcast from, it'll just automatically show up in your podcast feed. So that's all good. Anyways, that's all I got for this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay tuned to the Sports Podcast Network. Again, for all the soccer fans, Monday to Friday, 11 a.m., you have Soccer Today. And stay tuned. Like Mark mentioned, the F1 Pit Stop will be on SPN as well. The first 2 edition will be coming out a little bit after this very podcast.
Very good. It's nice to get the feed populated a little bit. Sometimes I kind of miss it when there's a couple of weeks in between races, so it's kind of nice to keep on top of things a little bit more than what we've been doing. But anyways, I think that's a wrap for now. Kevin, just let everybody know where they can find you online, please.
You can follow me on Twitter at Kev Laramée. On Facebook, just look for Kevin Laramée. You can like and follow me, and you can follow all the work that we do here on SPN at sportspodcastingnetwork.com.
Very good. And of course, the Scuderia F1 is on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod. And that is a wrap for this week. This was episode number 18 of Scuderia F1 Podcast, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. Until next time, after Japan, have a good F1.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.